Charles Sheeler. B. Philadelphia 1883, D. Dobbs Ferry 1965. A leading figure in American modernist painting, Charles Sheeler was also a highly respected photographer, which undoubtedly influenced the smooth, sharply defined precisionist style that he used to capture the modernization of the U.S. He studied both industrial design and art in Philadelphia before traveling to Europe, where he came across work by Cézanne and the Cubists. On his return to the U.S. in 1912, Sheeler earned his living as a commercial photographer, but continued to paint, mainly urban and industrial scenes, and in an increasingly photographic manner. In the 1940s, his work started to become more abstract, although it was no less meticulously painted. Following a stroke, Sheeler retired from both painting and photography in 1959. Upper Deck Sheeler's work as a photographer affected his choice of subject. He mainly concentrated on factory scenes, urban landscapes, and domestic interiors, subjects that allowed him to explore geometric shapes in a Cubist-influenced style. Upper Deck can be seen as a precisionist representation of machinery, but it is also a study in colors and forms. 1929, Oil on Canvas, 73 by 55 centimeters, Harvard University Art Museums, U.S. John Steuart Curry. B. Dunavant, 1897, D. Madison, 1946. With Grant Wood and Thomas Hart Benton, John Steuart Curry led the regionalist movement of the 1930s, a collection of artists depicting scenes from the Midwest. He was one of the great American scene painters, showing life in his native Kansas, even though much of his own life was spent outside the state. Before settling in New York, Curry studied in Chicago, and later Paris, and from 1936 he worked as artist-in-residence at the University of Wisconsin. Murals for the Kansas State Capitol building, now considered to be his masterpiece, aroused much controversy at the time and were left uncompleted. Baptism in Kansas. Curry made his name with this rural Kansas scene, painted from memory in New York. It is typical of his folksy narrative style, which was popular with East Coast urbanites. 1928, Oil on Canvas, 102 by 127 centimeters, Whitney Museum of American Art, New York, U.S. Grant Wood. B. Near Anamosa, 1891, D. Iowa City, 1942. With the phenomenal success of American Gothic, Grant Wood became probably the best known of the American regionalist painters. Born on a farm in Iowa, he spent his teenage years in Cedar Rapids, then traveled and studied in the U.S. and Europe before returning to his home state in 1932. He joined the staff of the University of Iowa's School of Art in 1934, where he taught painting. Much influenced by Netherlandish Renaissance oil painting, Wood developed a boldly realist style in his depictions of the Midwest, which are often tinged with a wry humor. He continued painting and teaching until his death from liver cancer, the day before his 51st birthday. American Gothic, named after the architectural style of the window in the background, Wood portrays an enigmatic, impassive farming couple in affectionate detail. 1930, Oil on Board, 74 by 62 centimeters, Art Institute of Chicago, U.S. All rights reserved by the estate of Nan Wood Graham / licensed by Vaga, New York, New York. Edward Hopper. B. Nyack, New York, 1882. D. New York, 1967. Edward Hopper's atmospheric portrayals of East Coast scenes have made him the best-known American realist painter of the 20th century. He was trained and worked as a commercial illustrator, but achieved the success he yearned for as a painter in the 1920s when House by the Railroad became the first painting bought by the Museum of Modern Art in New York. This was a turning point in Hopper's career, enabling him to concentrate on painting in the introspective, melancholic style that had evolved from his earlier impressionistic work. He and his wife took painting trips to rural New England, where he produced numerous pictures of typically American architecture. During the 1930s, Hopper also began to depict urban scenes with bright lights and intense shadows peopled with solitary figures. Towards the end of his life, when abstract art became fashionable, Hopper's work was unfairly dismissed as illustrative, a term he loathed. Lifeline. 1882. Born in Rockland County, New York State 1899 to 1906 Studies Illustration and Painting 1906 makes the first of several trips to Europe 1910 to 24 Works as an illustrator in New York 1923 Paints the Mansard Roof, which is bought by the Brooklyn Museum 1925 Paints House by the Railroad. The first of his mature works 1942 Paints Nighthawks, his most famous work 1967 Dies in New York. Evening Wind. Many of Hopper's early etchings featured female figures in urban New York settings, anticipating the lonely figures in his later paintings. 1921, etching 18 by 22 centimeters, Whitney Museum of American Art, New York, U.S. Nighthawks. Hopper's best-known work is a powerfully evocative depiction of urban alienation. The desolate mood of the almost empty diner and deserted streets is enhanced by Hopper's impassive realist style and the simplicity of the composition. 1942, Oil on Canvas, 76 by 152 centimeters, Art Institute of Chicago, U.S. Closer look. Inner light source. The brightly lit diner throws the street outside into gloomy, film noir-style shadows, making the diner an island of light in a dark streetscape. This contrast forces the viewer's attention to the interior scene, starkly illuminated by an overhead light on the right, the only light source in the painting. Focal point at the center of the diner, the woman's red dress and auburn hair stand out from the muted colors around her, intensifying all of the anonymity of the male customers. Them appear to be contained in a glass-sided case with no exit. The mansard roof. To begin with, Hopper only used watercolor for his illustrative work, but encouraged by his colleague and future wife Jo Nivison, he began to use the medium for seascapes and architectural paintings. 1923, watercolor over graphite on paper, 36 by 51 centimeters, Brooklyn Museum of Art, New York, U.S. Room in Brooklyn. Hopper's paintings often depict scenes of solitude or detachment. There is seldom any interaction between his characters, and often only a single figure. This feeling of isolation is emphasized by his predilection for harsh, one-directional light and sharply defined shadows. 1932, Oil on Canvas, 74 by 86 centimeters, Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, U.S. Thomas Hart. Benton. B. Neosho, 1889, D. Kansas City, 1975. The son of a U.S. congressman, Thomas Hart Benton rejected the family's traditional career of politics in favor of art. He studied at the Art Institute of Chicago, and also in Paris. On his return to the U.S., he moved to New York, where he painted in a modernist, sometimes abstract style. However, he found it increasingly difficult to reconcile the elitism of this style with his notions of the artist's place in society, and eventually abandoned modernism absolutely. During the 1920s and 30s, Benton's realist paintings and murals of rural life established him as a leading regionalist painter. Appalled by the politics of the New York art world, he left to teach at the Kansas City Art Institute in 1935, where Jackson Pollock was one of his students. He was dismissed in 1941 for his controversial leftist views and spent the rest of his career painting public murals in the Midwest. Haystack. Benton's historical murals and Midwestern scenes were not simply narrative, they were also social comments that reflected his populist Marxist views. 1938, Tempera with oil glaze on linen on panel, 61 by 76 centimeters, Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, U.S.